Welcome back to Sci-Fi Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without a budget to operate and pay our hardworking staff. If you enjoy our content, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our team can cover their living expenses and continue crafting these adventures for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or clicking the link in the description and comments. The galaxy operates on a very simple rule. It is an ancient warning etched into the very fabric of the cosmos, whispered among the oldest civilizations and passed down through countless generations. Do not ambush a human ship. They might look fragile. They might appear entirely alone. But those who ignore this ancient decree do not live long enough to regret their mistake. Deep space is a canvas of infinite cold, and Commander Tarek of the Valthor Empire painted upon it with the dark hues of absolute conquest. His massive fleet, a predatory formation of jagged warships, glided silently through the cosmic void at the very edge of the galactic rim. They were an armada of unparalleled destruction, heavily armed and completely shrouded in the most advanced stealth technology the Empire had ever engineered. It was here, in this desolate stretch of nothingness, that their long-range scanners detected a solitary vessel. It was a human exploration ship designated as Horizon. It drifted along a predictable trajectory, appearing as nothing more than a fragile speck of metal against the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the universe. Tarek sat firmly on his command throne, his cold, reptilian eyes locked onto the main viewing screen. The ancient warning of the cosmos echoed in the minds of every seasoned navigator within his ranks. Do not provoke the humans. Do not ambush their vessels under any circumstances. Yet, Tarek felt nothing but absolute disdain for what he considered superstitious cowardice. He placed unwavering faith in the invisible cloaking fields that enveloped his warships. To him, the humans were primitive, weak, and foolishly wandering into the hunting grounds of an apex predator. The warning was merely a myth, a bedtime story born from the incompetence of lesser alien races, who lacked the tactical brilliance of the Valthor. Down below, aboard the Horizon, the atmosphere was entirely different. Captain Beckett Barron stood confidently on his command bridge, staring out into the endless starfield. The human ship moved with a slow, deliberate calm, utterly undisturbed by the invisible armada that surrounded it on all sides. Tens of thousands of heavy artillery cannons were currently trained directly on its thin metallic hull, ready to unleash stellar annihilation at a single word from Tarek. Still, the Horizon continued on its pre-programmed path, its engines humming a low, steady, and comforting rhythm. There were no sudden evasive maneuvers, no erratic sensor sweeps, just the quiet confidence of a ship making a routine voyage through the dark. It appeared completely ignorant of the undeniable fact that it was caught dead in the center of a massive, deadly crosshair. Tarek leaned forward in his throne, a cruel, mocking smile touching his lips. He wanted to instill sheer terror before he claimed his prize. He wanted to watch the humans break. He issued the command. Instantly, the massive Valthor fleet dropped its cloaking screens, revealing their terrifying scale, and fired a colossal electromagnetic net. The burst of disruptive energy shot across the void and enveloped the Horizon in a blinding, violent flash. It was a highly calculated strike designed to fry their internal systems, cripple their navigational engines, and completely sever all internal and external communication lines. The psychological pressure of sudden, absolute silence in the face of overwhelming, heavily armed odds usually broke a crew before the boarding parties even crossed the threshold. The human vessel shuddered violently as the energy net seized it, dragging it to a dead halt in the cold vacuum of space. "Send the elite vanguard," Tarek commanded, his voice a low, threatening growl that resonated through the communication channels of his flagship. Breach their primary hull. I want them subjugated and brought to their knees. A full squadron of the most ruthless Valthor Special Forces launched from the flagship. They moved swiftly and silently through the vacuum, attaching their heavy magnetic boots to the cold exterior shell of the horizon. Their movements were precise, highly practiced, and undeniably lethal. The squad leader stepped forward and deployed a heavy thermal beam cutter, aiming the intense focal point directly at the thick magnetic seals of the primary cargo bay door. The intense heat flared brilliantly against the dark metal, melting through the advanced human alloys with agonizing slowness. Sparks showered silently into the endless void as the heavy locking mechanisms finally began to warp and give way under the overwhelming thermal pressure. The massive external door groaned, its heavy hinges resisting for only a fraction of a second before the vacuum of space forced it to swing wide open. The Valthor Vanguard immediately raised their heavy plasma rifles, fully expecting to meet the frantic, bloody chaos of a breached vessel. They anticipated the blaring wails of emergency sirens piercing the air, the flashing of crimson hazard lights illuminating the smoke, and the desperate, panicking screams of a terrified human crew scrambling to mount a futile, last-minute defense. Instead, there was nothing. The heavy doors stood wide open, revealing a long, dimly lit metallic corridor that stretched deep into the belly of the ship. Not a single alarm sounded. No red warning lights flashed. There was no desperate barricade hastily constructed from cargo crates, and not a single human soldier stood waiting to repel the heavily armed invaders. The silence that poured out from the breached hold was deeper and far more unnerving than the vacuum of space outside. It was a cold, deliberate invitation, an empty, yawning corridor that swallowed the light from their weapons and offered absolutely no resistance at all. The squad leader of the Valthor Vanguard took the first confident step over the threshold, his heavy magnetic boots clanking against the dark metallic floor of the human vessel. His troops followed in a tight, disciplined formation, their weapons raised and ready to sweep the area. They expected tight, claustrophobic corridors, the typical cramped architecture of a primitive species trying to save space and mass. However, as the last soldier crossed into the dimly lit interior, the sheer reality of their surroundings began to crush their minds. The space inside the ship was impossible. It was an overwhelming cavern of geometric architecture that stretched out in all directions, seemingly thousands of times larger than the physical dimensions they had just observed from the cold vacuum of space outside. It was as if they had stepped off a tiny, fragile raft and plunged straight into an endless, metallic ocean. Huge, towering pillars of dark steel disappeared into a ceiling that could not exist, and vast chasms dropped away into a terrifying, lightless abyss below their feet. The shadows themselves seemed to pool in the wrong directions, ignoring the sparse, pale artificial light that emanated from the bulkheads. The squad leader tapped the side of his helmet, attempting to activate his visor's advanced spatial mapping software. The Valthor Empire possessed the greatest navigational technology in the known galaxy, capable of charting complex star systems in mere seconds. Yet, after taking only 5 steps into the human ship, the holographic displays inside their helmets violently glitched and crashed. The navigational grids spun out of control, throwing up fatal error codes. The physical geometry of the corridors was actively defying the fundamental laws of physics. Hallways seemed to curve upwards at impossible angles, intersecting with other pathways in ways that made the Valthor soldiers feel physically sick. A corridor that clearly sloped downward would somehow lead them to a higher elevation. Solid bulkheads appeared to fold in on themselves, creating a maze of right angles that somehow formed a perfect, unbroken circle. The elite soldiers, trained to fight in zero-gravity and hostile alien environments, found their senses entirely paralyzed by a space that fundamentally rejected their understanding of reality. Their equilibrium was shattered, leaving them staggering, like poisoned animals in the dark. Then, a voice materialized from the suffocating emptiness. It did not boom over a hidden loudspeaker, nor did it crackle through their compromised communication channels. Instead, the deep, warm, and remarkably calm voice of Captain Beckett Barron seemed to manifest directly inside the enclosed atmosphere of their helmets, wrapping around them like a heavy, invisible blanket. "You have crossed a boundary you do not understand." The captain spoke, his tone completely devoid of anger or fear, which only made it infinitely more terrifying. "I am giving you one single opportunity to turn around. Leave this vessel immediately before the automated core defense systems recognize you as a terminal threat, and activate. If you proceed any further, I will not be able to stop what happens next." The calm warning shattered the remaining composure of the Vanguard. These were hardened killers, but they were not equipped to fight the very architecture of reality. Panic, raw, and primal, clawed at their disciplined minds. One of the soldiers, his breathing ragged and heavy, broke formation and aimed his heavy plasma rifle at a curved bulkhead, desperate to prove that the ship was just a physical object that could be broken. He pulled the trigger, unleashing a blinding, superheated beam of concentrated energy. Under normal circumstances, the plasma would have melted through heavy armor plating in a fraction of a second. Instead, as the lethal beam shot forward, the physical space around it warped. The deadly beam of light bended along the impossible, non-physical curvature of the room, arcing through the air like a boomerang. It looped violently back toward the firing squad, grazing the shoulder of the soldier who fired it, and superheating his outer armor layer. Total chaos erupted within the ranks. Other soldiers, driven by sheer terror, began firing their weapons blindly into the shifting corridors. Every single shot they took was instantly rejected by the ship's spatial distortion. Lethal energy beams twisted, spiraled, and ricocheted back into their formation, forcing the Valthor troops to dive to the impossible floor to avoid being slaughtered by their own crossfire. They were pinned down, trapped in a nightmare where the environment itself turned their aggression into a suicidal endeavor. "Fall back!" the squad leader screamed, his voice cracking with a fear he had never known. "Retreat to the breach point! Get back to the void!" A soldier at the rear of the formation scrambled backward, desperate to feel the cold, reassuring embrace of the outer space vacuum they had just left behind. He turned around, his hands reaching out to grab the melted edges of the heavy cargo door. But his hands grasped nothing but empty air. The massive breach they had just cut through the hull was completely gone. There was no door. There was no melted metal, no stars, no Valthor fleet waiting outside. The entrance had simply evaporated, replaced by another endless, twisting corridor of dark metal that stretched infinitely into the distance. They were entombed within a paradox, sealed inside a tomb that had no beginning and no end. As the horrifying realization of their entrapment settled over the squad, the absolute silence of the ship returned. But it was quickly broken by a new sound. It started as a faint, rhythmic thumping, echoing from the deep, unseen central core of the vessel. Thump, thump, thump. It was slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. The sound vibrated through the metal floor and crawled up the legs of their armored suits. Within moments, a terrifying biological phenomenon began to take hold. Without any conscious control, the heartbeats of the elite Valthor soldiers began to shift, accelerating and decelerating until they perfectly matched the eerie, rhythmic knocking of the ship. Then, their lungs followed suit. They found themselves inhaling and exhaling in absolute, involuntary synchronization with the pulse of the ship. Their own biology was rebelling against them, hijacked by the oppressive atmosphere of the human vessel. They were no longer invaders. They were entirely bound to the heartbeat of the void, stripped of their bodily autonomy, waiting in the suffocating dark for whatever was coming to claim them. Outside, Commander Tarek slammed his scaled fist against the armrest of his command throne. The tactical displays surrounding him had gone completely dark regarding the boarding party. Telemetry, vital signs, audio feeds, all of it vanished the exact second the Vanguard squad crossed the threshold of the human vessel. It was not a jamming signal. Jamming created static and interference. This was an absolute void, a mathematical impossibility indicating that the elite troops had simply ceased to exist within the observable universe. Fury, hot and blinding, replaced the commander's initial amusement. He refused to be humiliated by a lone, drifting human artifact. Leaning over the communication console, he ordered his gunners to power up the primary ion cannon. It was a weapon designed to shatter planetary defense grids, capable of delivering a payload of 50 million terajoules of pure, destructive energy. He wanted a warning shot right across the main hull, a brutal demonstration of overwhelming firepower that would rip a canyon through the human ship and force whoever was inside to beg for mercy. The flagship shuddered as the massive ion accelerators spun up to 100% capacity. A blinding beam of highly charged particles tore through the vacuum of space, striking the horizon dead center. Tarek expected the thin metallic shell to instantly vaporize, sending molten shrapnel flying into the void. Instead, a phenomenon that defied every known law of thermodynamics unfolded. The human ship did not buckle. It did not melt. The devastating kinetic and thermal energy of the ion blast was swallowed whole by the hull. The dark, metal surface rippled like liquid glass, drinking in the 50 million terajoules in a fraction of a second. Then, the vessel began to glow. The absorbed destructive energy was instantaneously converted into a pure, brilliant luminescence. A shockwave of radiant light erupted from the horizon, illuminating the pitch-black sector of space with the intensity of a newborn star. The Valthor fleet was bathed in a blinding, ethereal glow, their optical sensors struggling to compensate for the sudden, impossible brightness. The human ship had not just survived the strike. It had consumed it and repurposed the energy to fuel its own enigmatic mechanisms. Inside the impossible, labyrinthine corridors of the vessel, the Vanguard squad floated in a state of sheer terror. The deep, resonant voice of Captain Beckett Barron returned, washing over them with the steady, detached cadence of a scientist observing microbes in a petri dish. "You assume you have boarded a spacecraft," the captain stated clearly. "That is your first and most fatal miscalculation. The Horizon is not equipped with conventional thrusters or a warp drive. You are currently standing inside the containment field of a macroscale quantum probability manipulator." The words hung heavily in the artificial atmosphere. The ship was not traveling through physical space in the way the Valthor understood. It was continuously calculating infinite possibilities and collapsing the waveform of reality itself to alter its own physical state and surroundings. As if to demonstrate the terrifying truth of Barron's words, the fundamental constant of gravity within the compartment violently shattered. It did not simply turn off and plunge the intruders into standard zero gravity. Instead, gravity fractured into a dozen different multidimensional vectors. One soldier was violently pulled toward the ceiling with the crushing force of 3 standard gravities, while another was dragged sideways against a bulkhead. A third found his upper body pulled forward while his legs were anchored backward, stretching his heavily armored spine agonizingly. The elite Valthor troops were reduced to helpless, flailing puppets, tumbling through a chaotic intersection of gravitational currents. They could not find purchase. They could not aim their weapons, and they could not control the trajectory of their own bodies as they spun helplessly in the center of the vast, glowing chamber. Their advanced combat training was utterly useless against an environment that actively rewrote the laws of physics second by second. The distortion of physical space was only the beginning. The immense burst of energy absorbed from the fleet's ion cannon blast severely overloaded the local temporal field inside the vessel. Time itself began to fracture and fold in on the Valthor soldiers. The squad leader blinked, and suddenly, he was not looking at the metallic walls of the human ship. He was standing on the red sands of his homeworld, witnessing a childhood memory of his family with crystalline clarity. The hallucination was indistinguishable from reality. He could smell the dry dust and feel the heat of the twin suns beating down on his scales. But the vision twisted abruptly, shifting from nostalgia to a scene of absolute horror. The red sands dissolved into a dark, frozen landscape of twisted metal. He saw his own body, aged and broken, drifting in a sea of frozen debris. He was watching his own inevitable future death. All around him, the rest of the squad screamed in agony as they, too, were forced to experience their own scrambled timelines. They lived through their proudest victories, their deepest regrets, and their most agonizing demises simultaneously. The human ship was weaponizing their own localized timelines, trapping their consciousness in a continuous, torturous loop of past trauma and future doom. The visual and sensory overload was completely debilitating, pushing their alien minds to the very brink of absolute cognitive collapse. Baron's voice pierced through the agonizing symphony of their temporal hallucinations, cold and unforgiving. Every violent action you take, every hostile energy discharge your fleet directs at our exterior hull, is instantly fed into our probability matrix, the captain warned, the tone stripping away any remaining hope the invaders possessed. You are not damaging us. You are simply providing the raw power source for your own psychological and physical dismantling. The more you struggle, the more your reality will warp. If your commander fires another volley, the temporal shear will tear your consciousness apart entirely, long before your physical bodies expire. The captain offered no further explanation or demands. The alien soldiers were left floating helplessly in the multi-dimensional gravity storm, drowning in the vivid visions of their own deaths, fully realizing that their own powerful empire outside was the very instrument of their torturous execution. On the bridge of the flagship, the suffocating reality of his complete powerlessness finally shattered Commander Tarek's disciplined mind. The tactical silence from his elite boarding party, combined with the impossible glowing spectacle of the human vessel, eroded his arrogant composure until only a raw, primal rage remained. He was an apex predator, a decorated warlord of a galactic empire, and he would not be humiliated by a single, silent human artifact drifting in the dark. Logic and strategic preservation abandoned him entirely. He slammed both of his heavy-scaled fists onto the command console, shattering the holographic interface into a shower of sparks. "Open fire!" Tarek roared, his voice tearing at his throat. "All ships, cycle weapons to maximum yield. I want a full, unyielding bombardment. Grind that abomination into cosmic dust." A junior tactical officer hesitated for a fraction of a second, timidly reminding the commander that their own elite vanguard was still trapped inside the target. Tarek did not care. His eyes were wide and bloodshot with absolute madness. He ordered the immediate execution of the officer on the spot if the command was not relayed instantly. The survival of a single squad meant absolutely nothing compared to erasing this profound insult from the galaxy. Across the vast, cold expanse of space, the colossal Valthor armada responded to the deranged order. Thousands of heavy cruisers and massive dreadnoughts simultaneously ignited their primary weapon arrays. Tens of thousands of armor-piercing missiles, superheated plasma torpedoes, and devastating antimatter lasers erupted from the fleet in a synchronized wave of absolute annihilation. It was a barrage terrifying enough to crack a small moon in half, painting the dark canvas of space with blinding, violent streaks of lethal energy. The deadly swarm of munitions tore across the void, converging on the solitary, glowing hull of the horizon with perfect, lethal precision. Tarek watched the main viewing screen, his breath held in his chest, anticipating the glorious, fiery detonation that would vindicate his wounded pride and restore his dominance. But the explosion never came. As the front line of the devastating ordnance struck the exterior plating of the human ship, the missiles and lasers did not detonate. They simply passed straight through the vessel. The Horizon did not execute evasive maneuvers, nor did its shields flare up to deflect the kinetic blows. The ship merely phased out of physical reality, rendering its massive metallic structure as immaterial as a projected optical illusion. Volley after volley of highly explosive torpedoes flew seamlessly through the main thrusters, passed right through the command bridge, and exited out the other side, continuing harmlessly into the deep void behind the target. The greatest display of firepower in the history of the Valther Empire was completely nullified by a phantom. Before Tarek could even process the impossible visual of his fleet's ultimate barrage, passing through solid matter like ghosts, the ambient lighting on the command bridge violently shifted from standard tactical blue to a blinding, flashing crimson. Every single display console across the entire Valthor armada erupted in a synchronized chorus of critical red error warnings. Klaxons wailed incessantly, cutting through the tense, heavy silence of the bridge. The central computing intelligence of the flagship, an entity capable of processing trillions of calculations per second, was desperately trying to warn them of a fatal mathematical anomaly. The frantic chief science officer screamed over the blaring alarms, his voice cracking with pure terror. The sensors were no longer reading the Horizon as a standard mechanical vessel. The physical mass of the human ship was increasing at an exponential rate every single second. It had doubled, then multiplied by 10, then multiplied by 100, growing so impossibly dense that the gravitational sensors of the entire Valthor fleet were being crushed under the sheer mathematical weight of the incoming data. The localized space surrounding the human ship was violently buckling under a mass that should only belong to a supermassive celestial body, not a solitary exploration craft. Desperate to understand the apocalyptic sensor readings, the chief science officer bypassed standard protocols and initiated a full spectrum deep scan, forcing the flagship's sensors to pierce through the shifting, immaterial outer hull of the Horizon and gaze directly into its deepest central core. The main viewing screen flickered violently, struggling to render the impossible physics, before finally displaying the horrifying truth. The twisting, nonsensical corridors the boarding party had encountered were not designed for crew transport or living quarters. As the scan stripped away the outer structural layers, a colossal, terrifying anomaly was revealed at the very heart of the vessel. Tarek felt the blood freeze completely in his veins as he stared at the screen. Resting dead in the center of the ship was a pulsating, spherical void of absolute darkness. It was not a conventional warp drive. It was an artificial black hole embryo. It was alive, beating with a slow, rhythmic pulse that perfectly matched the horrifying thumping the doomed boarding party had experienced earlier. The intense, crushing darkness of the anomaly bent the starlight of the entire sector around its edges, radiating an aura of pure, inescapable doom. The devastating reality crashed down upon Tarek, crushing his sanity under the immense weight of his own monumental mistake. The Horizon was never an exploration ship. It was never a vessel meant for deep space travel. The entire grand, sprawling architecture of the ship, the impossible geometries, the quantum probability fields, and the heavy metallic plating were all just pieces of an elaborate, incredibly sturdy gravitational cage. The humans had not built a ship to sail the stars. They had constructed an intricate lockbox to imprison a cosmic devourer. The massive containment shell was specifically engineered to artificially suppress the terrifying gravitational pull of the singularity, preventing the black hole embryo from waking up and mercilessly swallowing an entire star system whole. Humanity had mastered the primordial, destructive forces of the universe, and instead of weaponizing them to conquer their neighbors, they had chosen to put them on a leash, hiding them away in the quiet, desolate corners of the galaxy to protect the rest of the cosmos. Tarek fell back heavily into his command throne, his limbs trembling uncontrollably as the final, fatal consequence of his blinding arrogance was fully realized. The human captain had explicitly warned him. Every violent action, every hostile energy discharge, only fed the anomaly. The continuous, overwhelming bombardment from the tens of thousands of Valthor warships had not destroyed the ship. It had acted as a massive influx of kinetic and thermal energy. That staggering amount of destructive power was exactly what the quantum matrix needed to shatter the first safety seal of the gravitational cage. The relentless, foolish attack of the Armada had unintentionally picked the lock of the universe's most dangerous prison. On the main screen, the artificial black hole abruptly stopped its slow, steady heartbeat and suddenly expanded with a violent jerk. The dormant beast had been fully awakened by their barrage. Invisible, terrifying tendrils of extreme gravity immediately lashed out from the core of the horizon, completely ignoring the physical distance of the void. In a matter of seconds, the massive dreadnoughts and cruisers of the Valthor fleet began to violently shudder and groan under the sudden pressure. The bridge plunged into total darkness as the awakened singularity easily bypassed their physical armor and began to directly siphon the life energy, the engine plasma, and the very light straight out of the warships. The apex predators had foolishly unlocked the cage of a monster they could not possibly comprehend, and now they were being actively consumed by the very abyss they had so arrogantly tried to destroy. The suffocating darkness of the bridge was only broken by the violent, flashing red warnings. Commander Tarek, his scales pale and his breath shallow, realized the absolute magnitude of his fatal error. The hunter had become the prey, caught in a cosmic trap of his own making. Panic, cold and absolute, finally shattered the last remnants of his warlord persona. He scrambled toward the shattered command console, his claws frantically tearing at the manual override panels. "All vessels, initiate emergency slipspace jumps," he screamed, his voice raw and devoid of its former authority. "Cut primary life support and reroute all available power to the main thrusters. We must break orbit now." Across the vast armada, tens of thousands of highly advanced warp drives roared to life, burning through their fuel reserves at terrifying speeds. The massive dreadnoughts shuddered, trying desperately to tear themselves away from the solitary human ship. However, it was entirely futile. Tarek watched in absolute horror as the velocity indicators on his tactical screen remained frozen at exactly 0. The engines burned with the fury of 1,000 suns. Yet the fleet did not move a single inch. The invisible, overwhelming gravitational pull from the awakened singularity inside the horizon had already locked its jaws around them. They were flies caught in a web forged from the fundamental fabric of space-time. Outside the flagship, the majestic and terrifying Valthor Armada began to die. The artificial black hole did not strike with lasers or kinetic payloads. It simply demanded that reality bend to its will. The invisible tidal forces began to tear apart the very membrane of space surrounding the human containment vessel. Tarek watched helplessly through the reinforced viewing port as the proudest warships of his empire were slowly, agonizingly dismantled. Heavy cruisers, built to withstand the devastating impact of planetary collisions, groaned under the immense gravitational shear. Their thick metallic hulls warped and buckled inward. Support beams snapped like dry twigs, and massive engine nacelles were violently ripped away from the main fuselages, floating silently into the dark void. The magnificent, jagged formations of the Valthor fleet were instantly reduced to a chaotic debris field of twisted metal and floating scrap, entirely suspended in a terrifying state of gravitational paralysis, waiting for the final, surging tide of crushing death to consume them. Deep inside the shifting, non-physical corridors of the horizon, the horrifying ordeal of the elite Vanguard squad finally reached its quiet, merciful conclusion. As the outer containment seals cracked and the black hole embryo demanded more sustenance, the internal safety protocols of the human vessel initiated a desperate measure to buy time. The soldiers, still trapped in their agonizing temporal loops, did not experience the gruesome, crushing death they had anticipated. Instead, the localized quantum fields around them vibrated at a hyper-accelerated frequency. In less than 1 second, the physical matter of their armored suits, their weapons, and their very bodies underwent a painless, instantaneous disintegration. They were broken down at the subatomic level, their physical forms dissolving into brilliant, swirling streams of pure, white energy. These ethereal currents of raw power were immediately siphoned away into the massive central core, merging seamlessly with the failing gravitational matrix. The aggressive invaders were fundamentally repurposed, their life force used to temporarily stabilize the horrific anomaly they had so foolishly awakened. As the chaotic symphony of tearing metal and blaring alarms reached its peak, every single communication channel across the dying Valthor fleet was forcefully overridden. The deep, resonant voice of Captain Beckett Barron filled the desperate darkness of Tarek's command bridge once more. This time, there was no cold detachment. The captain spoke with a profound, aching sorrow, carrying the heavy burden of a species that truly understood the terrifying cost of violence. "We did not ask for this," Barron stated, his tone deeply empathetic, yet entirely unwavering. "Humanity does not build weapons to conquer the stars. Commander, we do not forge tools of destruction to wipe out our neighbors. We merely harness the raw, primordial forces of the cosmos to test the restraint of those who claim to rule it. The universe is a harsh, unforgiving place, but it is the boundless greed and unchecked arrogance of conquerors that truly brings about annihilation. We place this vessel here as a mirror. You attacked an unprovoked traveler. You ignored the ancient warnings. You are not being destroyed by a human weapon. You are being consumed by the direct consequence of your own violent ambition." The profound truth of the human captain's words pierced through Tarek's fractured mind, leaving no room for excuses or defiant pride. He looked at the tactical displays, watching the life signs of tens of thousands of his loyal crew members flashing frantically in the darkness. These were not just soldiers. They were navigators, engineers, and innocent personnel who had blindly followed his arrogant orders into the abyss. The crippling weight of his catastrophic failure finally forced the apex predator to his knees. The great commander of the Valthor Empire collapsed onto the cold floor of the bridge, pressing his forehead against the metallic grating in a gesture of absolute, undeniable defeat. He discarded his lifelong conditioning, throwing away every ounce of his warlord pride. "Please," Tarek choked out, his voice breaking into a desperate, hollow sob that echoed across the open communication channel. "I yield. I surrender entirely and unconditionally. The fault is mine alone. My arrogance brought us to this ruin. Take my life. Take my flagship, but please, I beg of you, spare my crew. Do not let 50,000 innocent souls pay the price for my monumental vanity." The gravitational anomaly at the core of the human vessel pulsed with a chaotic, violent instability. The artificial black hole embryo had consumed too much ambient energy from the fleet's foolish bombardment. The containment matrix was failing, and the singularity reached its absolute critical threshold. The localized spacetime fabric began to tear apart, threatening to trigger a massive, uncontrolled cosmic rupture. If the singularity collapsed completely, it would generate a devastating supernova-class explosion, instantly erasing the Valthor Armada, the human vessel, and the entire surrounding quadrant of the galaxy from existence. There would be no survivors, only a silent, expanding void of nothingness. On the bridge of his dying flagship, Commander Tarek remained on his knees, his desperate plea echoing into the silent abyss. For several agonizing seconds, the universe held its breath. Then, Captain Beckett Barron made his final, monumental decision. He did not gloat, nor did he condemn the kneeling conqueror. Instead, the human captain manually engaged the ultimate override command of his vessel. He initiated the primary sacrifice protocol. To reverse the catastrophic gravitational collapse, the ship needed an immense, instantaneous influx of pure mass. Barron systematically unlocked the hyperdense reserve cores of the ship, willingly offering the entire structural integrity and accumulated quantum mass of the horizon to feed the starving singularity. Prioritizing the lives of his enemies over his own survival, the immense sacrifice triggered a breathtaking cosmic reaction. As the artificial black hole swallowed the unimaginable mass of the human ship, the gravitational polarity violently inverted. Instead of crushing inward, the collapsing singularity expelled a colossal, brilliant shockwave of pure spatial displacement. In exactly 1 millisecond, the terrifying, invisible grip that held the Valthor Armada captive was shattered. The massive wave of radiant kinetic force hit the jagged warships, but it did not tear them apart. It acted as an impossible, celestial tidal wave, physically blowing the entire fleet thousands of leagues backward, safely out of the fatal event horizon and away from the crushing gravity well. As the shockwave dissipated, the furious, tearing anomaly abruptly ceased. The terrifying vortex of the black hole collapsed inward upon itself, fully neutralized by the immense mass of the human vessel. The sprawling, impossible architecture of the horizon folded in on itself, compressing with unimaginable force. The vast metallic corridors, the quantum engines, and the very souls of the brave human crew were fused together under the extreme pressure. In mere moments, the colossal ship was transformed. It condensed into a single, flawless, monolithic crystal, perfectly smooth and entirely harmless. It drifted silently into the dark void, an eternal monument of sacrifice, entering a state of permanent hibernation amidst the quiet sea of stars. Aboard the Valthor flagship, the terrifying red alarms finally fell silent. The emergency backup lights flickered to life, revealing a miraculous scene. The fleet had survived. Tens of thousands of crew members picked themselves off the deck plates, drawing deep, shuddering breaths of life they thought they had lost. However, as the tactical officers scrambled to assess the damage, a profound and permanent realization washed over the bridge. The spatial shockwave had surgically burned out their systems. Every single plasma cannon, missile battery, and shield generator across the entire armada was irreparably fried. Furthermore, their advanced combat thrusters were completely neutralized, leaving only their basic, sublight navigational engines intact. They were no longer an armada of conquerors. They had been permanently disarmed, transformed in an instant into a massive fleet of peaceful wanderers, entirely incapable of ever waging war again. Commander Tarek rose slowly from his knees, his eyes locked on the main viewing screen. He stared at the solitary, floating crystal that had once been the horizon. He turned to his surviving crew, his voice quiet, but filled with absolute clarity. "Deploy a salvage drone. Bring the relic aboard carefully. We are going home." He would carry this silent, heavy monument back to the very center of the Valthor Empire. He would not return as a glorious warlord, but as a humbled, living witness to the most terrifying and beautiful truth in the universe. He would stand before the High Council and present the crystal, spreading a new gospel of profound terror and absolute reverence for humanity. The ancient warning of the cosmos still echoed through the stars. But its meaning had been fundamentally rewritten. It was no longer just a tale of caution. The galaxy would forever whisper the absolute truth. Do not ever ambush a human ship. Not because they are weak or easy prey, but because humanity holds the keys to absolute, apocalyptic destruction in the palms of their hands. Yet, when pushed to the very brink of the abyss, they are so unbelievably great that they will always choose mercy. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for listening to today's story. Where in the world are you tuning in from right now? I would love to know. As I mentioned earlier, our channel is currently operating without any monetization from YouTube. If you enjoyed this journey and want to help us keep making these stories, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen, or by using the PayPal link provided in the description and the comments section below. Your single dollar helps pay the wages of our dedicated staff, allowing them to feed their families and continue creating amazing content for you. Thank you for your incredible kindness and support.